This is our last class, of course, and ultimately what I want to do today is focus on something that I think Midrash does very well and is sometimes underappreciated for so doing, which is exaggerating or accentuating elements of the narrative that are peculiar in their own right. And then the Midrash accentuates the peculiarity almost in order to help us notice it. But first, some background to the Parsha. I like to try and set each Parsha within the narrative arc of the book that it's in before we dive into any Midrashic analysis. So, you know, at the end of Sefer Shemot, all those weeks ago, the end of the book of Exodus, you got to this stage where the Jews, they'd left Egypt, they'd stood at Mount Sinai, they'd heard God speak, then they'd fallen into the sin of the golden calf, and it was there at Mount Sinai that Moshe brought reconciliation between God and the people, and it was there that they also built the Tabernacle, the Mishkan. And then we had this whole book, the Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which sets out the laws that are most pertinent to the running of the Mikdash, of the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, and to the function that cult plays in the creation of hopefully a holy people. So it's only now in the book of Bamidbar that we actually get back really to the narrative. It's only now in the book of Bamidbar, indeed, that the Jewish people actually leave Sinai. They've been at Mount Sinai all this time. In the opening Parshiot, Parshat Bamidbar and Parshat Naso, there's kind of a lot of stock taking. There's a census. We're told how the camp is supposed to be organized, each tribe given a specific position in the camp around the flag. The priests are told, you know, who's going to be responsible for carrying which bits of the tabernacle, preparing for this journey that we're about to go on. And then it's in last week's reading, we heard about the inauguration of the tabernacle. We'd already heard about that in the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, but there's a slightly different perspective in the book of Bamidbar. In Vayikra, the perspective is almost like, what did this look like for the priests, for the Kohanim? There was this terrible family disaster of Nadav and Avihu's death, the death of the sons of Aaron. Here in the book of Bamidbar, the focus was on the other tribes. Right? Each tribe has a prince that brought its own gift, one per day in a 12-day ceremony. And the only tribe that didn't get, to play that role was the priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi. And some say that's why this week's reading, Parshat Bahalotcha, starts with a special honor given to Aaron the priest, because he is basically the prince of the tribe of Levi, who was left out last week, poor thing. So he's given the honor of lighting the menorah in the tabernacle. And then the tribe of Levi, beyond the priestly elite, are given their special roles and they go through an initiation. And then, almost as if to mark just how long the Jews have been stationed at Sinai, we're told that they celebrated Pesach, right? So a whole year's gone by now since the Exodus. And then we have this part about those who weren't allowed to take part in the Pesach ritual because they'd been impure. They pleaded to be given another opportunity. And that's what gives us the biblical source for the notion of a Pesach Sheni, like a second Pesach for those who weren't able to do the first one. And then finally, with all of these preliminaries out of the way, and it's midway through this week's Parsha, finally the camp is ready to move on from Sinai. Special trumpets are made, which are going to signal whenever a journey is to begin. And we're told that they're never going to know exactly where or when they're going to go. They just have to follow the cloud by day and the fire by night. And where it comes to rest is where the camp has to set up for how long. No one's going to know. It could be for days, it could be for years. And they're not allowed to move until the cloud or the fire moves. and until the trumpets are sounded. Our reading contains also a good deal of drama, because as soon as the Jews get moving, they take to complaining again. Right? The journey is arduous. They complain about the food. The manna that falls down is no substitute for the meat. It's actually in the face of these complaints that Moses comes as close as he ever does to a breakdown and a crisis of confidence. In order to make his role easier, a council of 70 sages is established to share the burden of leadership. Right? And it's that point, it's actually going to be one of the hooks for the Midrashic adventure I want to take you on. But before we do, it's also in the aftermath of Moshe's loss of confidence that Aaron and Miriam have a conversation that is deemed to have been critical of Moshe behind his back. The details are a bit opaque, what exactly was wrong with what they said. But either way, God's not happy, and he intercedes to let them know the degree to which Moshe differs from other prophets, and he punishes them, specifically Miriam, for the sin of Lashon Hara, wicked speech. But despite all of the drama, I said I want to focus on an incident that occurs as Moshe's leaving, as the Jewish people are leaving. As they get moving, Moshe has a conversation with his father-in-law. Now, who's his father-in-law? Right, we only know of Moshe having one wife. So presumably, he only had one father-in-law. However, this father-in-law has a number of different names. In the book of Shemot, we saw him already, and his name is Yitro. But here, in the book of Bamidbar, he's called Chovav. So let's just assume, in line with the Jewish tradition, that they're the same person with just multiple names. Yitro Chovav. Okay. And what we see is the chronology of the story is really difficult to put together, because Yitro visits the Jewish people before the revelation at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, in Parshat Yitro, right? And it was at that time that he advised Moshe to do what? To delegate some of his leadership functions, specifically to create a council of sages, which he doesn't seem to do until this week, right? In the aftermath of this crisis of confidence, which leads us to think, well, maybe that didn't happen so long ago. Maybe it happened now, because also we're speaking about Chovav again, the father-in-law again, right? Okay, at the end of that chapter in the book of Exodus, Moses sends his father-in-law home. Bye-bye, father-in-law, see you another time, right? But now in this week's reading, set a year after the revelation at Sinai, what we see is Moshe pleads with his father-in-law not to leave, right? But when did his father-in-law come back? Right? And why does Moshe no longer want to let him go? So, you know, what's going on? And the classical commentaries have something of a field day with this, right? So Rashi argues, and it's relatively compelling given the difficulty here. Rashi argues that the Torah's presentation of the story just doesn't follow the actual chronology. Yitro didn't arrive before the giving of the Torah. He arrived much later, which makes sense because all these people are queuing up to ask Moshe questions about the law, presumably. And Yitro says, oh, Moshe, you can't handle this alone. You need a council of sages. You need a decentralized or a less centralized judiciary. But the law hadn't been given at that point in the story. So Rashi says this is just all out of order. Yitro didn't come before the giving of the Torah. He came after the giving of the Torah. And we should trust the chronology of the book of Numbers, of Bamidbar, over the chronology of the book of Shemot. Right? This Parsha is accurate. This Parsha is when it really happened. It happened just before they leave Sinai. That's when Moshe has his breakdown of confidence. That's when they appoint the panel of sages. So presumably that's also when Yitro gave Moshe the advice to create such a panel. But the Ramban, Nachmanides, on the other hand, he's always keen to read the order of the biblical verses as true to the chronology whenever he possibly can. Okay, Nachmanides does. So on his reading, Yitro simply came to visit the Israelites twice. He visited briefly before the revelation at Sinai, at which point Moshe was happy to let him leave, bye-bye father-in-law, in the knowledge that he'd return. Yitro returned, and it's now in this week's reading that Moshe becomes distressed at the thought that Yitro will now be leaving for good, okay? And the debate between Rashi and the Ramban is an echo of an earlier Talmudic debate. If people want to chase this up, it's in Tractate Zvachim 116a, about the exact chronology of the appearance of Yitro Chovav. But I just want to focus more locally on the conversation between Moshe and Chovav, okay, that appears in this week's Parsha. And here it is. It says, Vayomer Moshe leChovav ben Reuel Hamidjani choten Moshe. Moses said to Chovav, son of Reuel the Midianite, his father-in-law, this is what he said. Noseim anachnu el hamakom asher amar Hashem oto aten lachem. Let's go together to the place that God said, I'm going to give to you. Lecha itanu, come with us. Vehetavnu lach, and it's going to be great for you. Ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael, because God has spoken well about Israel. Vayomer elav, and Chovav said to Moshe, Lo elech, I'm not going to go. Ki im el artzi ve'el moladati elech. I'm going to go to my land and to my birthplace. Exactly what God told Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis. God appears to Abraham and says, leave your land and leave your homeland, right? Lech lecha ma'artzecha u'mebeit avicha. You should leave your land, you should leave the house of your father, and you should leave moladetcha, your homeland. Chovav says, no, I'm going back to all those places. I'm going back to my land. I'm going back to my homeland. Vayomer, and Moshe responds, Al na ta'azov otanu, please don't abandon us. Ki al kein yadata chanotenu b'midbar, because you've known our wilderness encampment, you know our camp. V'hayita lanu le'einayim, and you can be, or you will be, or you have been for us like eyes. And there's a large debate among the commentators as to exactly what that means. You've been like eyes to us. The commentaries range from the suggestion that Moshe is worried about espionage, that since Chovav knows the inner architecture of the camp, he knows all of the state and military secrets, there's some danger involved in letting him go. And perhaps that's what this idiom of being like eyes is all about. And more perhaps favorably to Chovav, another central suggestion of the commentators is that Chovav knows a great deal about living in the wilderness. He's a Midianite prince or chief. He's experienced in leadership, and just like the eyes kind of are sometimes associated with a sort of wisdom, you know, people say, "Oh, I see," instead of "Oh, I understand," or in the idiom of the Yerushalmi Talmud, "Ta'chazi," come and see, come and understand. There's some notion that Chovav has a certain sort of wisdom, perhaps a certain sort of practical wisdom that will be of use to the Jewish people as they make this journey. But either way, what's clear is Moshe doesn't want Chovav to leave. And then Chovav says, he responds, Moshe continues. He says, V'haya, and it shall be, if you come with us, the good that God promised to give to us, right, will be extended to you too, right? Now, what I want to concentrate on, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. What I want to concentrate on here is the role that this conversation plays in the rabbinic imagination, quite broadly construed. Chovav is considered to be, by a large number of the ancient rabbis, but by no means all of them, a convert to Judaism. Okay, and he's sometimes held up as an archetypal example of a convert to Judaism. Now, in actual fact, I'll get back to this later, the Bible doesn't really have any very clear-cut example of a convert. Now you're going to think that's strange. You're immediately going to think of Ruth, right? And we'll come to Ruth in a moment. But what you don't see is religious conversion, where someone we'll look at what happens in the New Testament as a contrast later on. But when someone is kind of struck by the truth of what had hitherto been an alien religion, and that one sees the light and converts to the new religion, the closest you get to that is in the book of Malachim. There's a figure called Naaman, who Elisha cures of leprosy. And he says, now I know that there is only the God of Israel, that the God of Israel is true. As Kayla points out in the conversation, you've got this notion of joining the Jewish people rather than the notion of joining the Jewish religion. But what we'll see, I think, is that the rabbis don't tend to see a very big difference between those two options, right? Between joining the people and joining the religion. And as you point out, Kayla, that's also going to have ramifications for contemporary discussions about the nature of Jewish identity and the nature of conversion, of joining the Jewish people. Okay. But, and the reason why there's some ambiguity about Chovav is because this is where the story ends, with Moshe's plea to Chovav, oh, please don't go. And the story just doesn't make clear whether he goes or not. Right now, if you read it like Rashi, and the story in Exodus and the story in Numbers are actually the same story told somehow differently, it's clear that Yitro leaves, because in Parshat Yitro he leaves. If you read this like Nachmanides, where this is actually his second trip, nowhere does it say clearly that he leaves. We know that he has some descendants in the Bible who live in the land of Israel and live in harmony with the Jewish people, live kind of in a close alliance with the Jewish people. This leads some to say, well, Chovav did go home at the end of this story, but only to kind of gather his children and whatever and bring them with. You know, does he fully convert or does he become something less than a full convert? It's all left somewhat ambiguous. But the point is, okay, he is one of the characters. Oh, by the way, Naaman in Book of Malachim, he doesn't join the Jewish people. He goes back home. And that's why he's never held up by the rabbis as an example of a convert. Okay, even though he comes to believe in the religion of Judaism, in the God of Judaism, he's not held up as a convert. But anyway, one way of reading this speech between Moshe and Chovav, if you're doing it through the lens of the rabbis, is Moshe is trying to convince Chovav to convert to Judaism. But if that's the case, he's made a really terrible pitch, right? Because if I was trying to convert Chovav to Judaism, I was trying to proselytize Chovav, okay? I might say things about the truth of Judaism. I might say something like, Chovav, like God freed us from Egypt with 10 wondrous plagues, And then he revealed himself at Mount Sinai and spoke, and we all heard him. And he gave us a law book. And have you noticed, Chovav, that while you've been staying with us in the desert, we've been eating miracle food, right, that's falling down from heaven. I mean, there's no doubt, Chovav, that this is the true religion. And this is God's will. And we know what God's will is, right? And we have a better understanding of what God's will is for us than any other people do for what God's will is for them. So join us and follow God's will for us. And you know, that would be a compelling case. And yet that's not what Moshe says. And in fact, God only really features here in this speech as like an insurance policy, something like, don't worry, God has promised that things are going to be good for us. So we'll share that with you too. But it's not like, come and let's serve God in the best way possible. Or it's not like focused around God. God is just something like an assurance here. This leads me to want to compare, before we get to any Midrashim, it makes me want to compare this speech of Moshe with the famous speech that Ruth makes to Naomi, where, you know, where she, in most classical understandings, she basically converts to Judaism. In fact, many of the laws of conversion to Judaism in Tractate Yevamot are learned from the speech that Ruth makes to Naomi. So this is in the first chapter of the book of Ruth. But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her. So one thing I want to point out is there is a verbal similarity between our two passages. Okay, they both talk about land. That's well, they don't talk about land explicitly, but like, where you go, I will go, and in that place I will be buried. But the real verbal analogy is around this verb la'azvech, which is to abandon. Okay, Ruth says to Naomi, "Don't allow me to abandon you." It literally means al tifke'i bi la'azvech, means don't suffer me the harm of abandoning you. Right? Don't, like, I don't want to abandon you. It will hurt me even to be allowed to abandon you, is what she seems to be saying. And that word to abandon also appeared in the speech that Moshe made to Chovav. He says, "Al na ta'azov otanu," do not abandon us. The same verb, ayin, zayin, bet, right? So in a kind of mirror image, the would-be proselytizer in the book of Numbers is urging the would-be proselyte not to abandon the Jewish people. And in the book of Ruth, the would-be proselyte abandons the reluctant proselytizer, right, on the grounds that she doesn't want to abandon, right? So as Kayla points out, the biblical presentation of conversion, and perhaps conversion is just an anachronistic term to use, right? Because of conversion as a religious notion maybe comes later. But the closest thing the Hebrew Bible has to conversion seems to revolve around this notion of abandonment, okay, of the people. Right? Are you going to stick with this people or not? And I think it's worth comparing to this amazing conversion story in the book of Acts in the New Testament. I don't like calling it the New Testament because that makes the old one sound outdated. I call it the Christian Testament. In the Christian Testament, in the book of Acts, yeah, this follows story is a really amazing story. Okay, it's about Paul on the road to Damascus. I don't know how many of you have read it inside, right? It says, as he neared Damascus, he was going there with the express purpose, of course, of persecuting Christians, right? As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Paul, Paul, why do you persecute me? And he says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I'm Jesus, whom you were persecuting. And he says, now get up and go into the city and you'll be told what you must do. The men traveling with Paul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone. Paul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. And then what happens is an ellipsis here. Jesus appears to a disciple in Damascus and tells him to go and heal Paul. So he goes to Paul and placing his hands on Paul, he said, Brother Paul, the Lord Jesus who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately, something like scales fell from Paul's eyes and he could see again. He got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. Now, in the book of Ruth, our archetypal convert, the biblical character from who the rabbis learn all of the laws of conversion, she doesn't have scales fall from her eyes. She doesn't have a vision of God. She doesn't see the light, okay? It's all about the fact she doesn't want to leave Naomi. That seems to be. Now, God appears in Ruth's speech. But the question is he the pinnacle of Ruth's speech or the afterthought in Ruth's speech? And I suppose you could read it in two ways. You could read it as like a crescendo. So wherever you go, I'll go. Whether you lodge, I lodge. Your people will be my people, and most importantly, your God will be my God. Right? So it's a big theological commitment. You could read it that way. Alternatively, you could focus on the fact that she says, Kol Yosef, sorry, Kol Yaseh Hashem li v'cho Yosef ki hamavet yafrid beini uveinech. This and more may God do to me, you know, if anything but death should part us. That makes me think, you know, that she doesn't really care so much about what God thinks of her, what God does to her, what the theological consequences of this are. It makes me think that all that matters to her is her proximity, her fidelity, her fraternity, but that would be the wrong word, sorority with Naomi, sisterhood with Naomi. So, no, I would read it as almost a diminuendo. It's where you go, I'll go. And therefore, you know, of course, where you lodge, I'll lodge because I'm going with you. And yeah, your people will be my people because it's your people and I'm with you. And even your God, you know, fine. If it comes to that, you know, I don't care. Let God do what he wants to me, right? I'm with you. And read in that way, it's even further away from Paul, because not only is there no vision, no seeing the light, no scales falling from her eyes, there's also very little theological content or commitment, or even perhaps care, read that way. And, you know, just to summarize where we've got, right, we see that if Chovav and Ruth are being understood as the rabbis did understand them, either as converts or prospective converts, then conversion, according to Tanakh, has quite little emphasis on religious reasons. Moshe doesn't say to Chovav, oh, stay with us because our religion is true. And again, you might say, well, that's anachronistic. They didn't think in terms of religion and religious conversion. Well, I know that, but the rabbis did. And the rabbis were looking back at these sources as their source texts for conversion. And there seems to be little emphasis on religious reasons. seems to be, just from a close reading of the text, that the decision not to leave and not to abandon seems to be what's really key. That's what Moshe asks Chovav not to do. That's what Ruth pleads with Naomi not to be allowed to do, not to leave. And you can compare this with the verse in the book of Isaiah 14:1. Let me just find the verse. Isaiah 14:1. Isaiah 14:1. Safaria, that will do it. Here we are. Isaiah foresees a day where the Jewish people will attract a lot of converts, for instance, in the end of days. And he says at the beginning of chapter 14, Ki yirachem Hashem et Yaakov, God will have mercy on Jacob, uvachar od b'Yisrael, he will once again choose Israel, v'hinicham al admatam, and he will allow them to rest or settle on their land, v'nilva hager aleihem, and the proselyte will accompany them, v'nispachu, and they will cleave al Beit Yisrael, they will cleave to the Jewish people. Okay. So I like thinking of Jewish conversion in the biblical imagination as the decision to cleave rather than to leave. Are you cleaving or are you leaving? Right? And it has not that much to do with theology. Now, what you might expect, especially given Kayla's kind of accurate observations, that look, the Bible is thinking tribalistically, it's thinking about tribal identity. The notion of religious conversion is a later innovation. So what you might expect is that the rabbis will try to accentuate the theological content of Ruth's speech. Because if we're going to learn religious conversion from Ruth, where perhaps the biblical authors only had in mind kind of tribal, national membership, you might imagine that the rabbinic texts will try and accentuate the theological. But they don't. In fact, they go to the opposite extreme. They accentuate the extent to which Ruth's speech was not theological. Okay, and therefore, in a sense, they make trouble for themselves. Okay, the rabbis seem to make things worse. So the first Midrash we can look at is the Midrash in Ruth Rabbah, chapter 2, kind of paragraph 22. Let's have a look. Kate just said, when or by whom is the religious framing of Judaism introduced? Since in biblical times it seems pretty exclusively tribal. Is it a Jewish invention or is it from other cultural influences? These are great questions. I wonder to what extent Christianity influenced Jewish thoughts around conversion. I mean, the earliest texts that we have that really do start to conceive of conversion more religiously, right? So you have mikveh as a prerequisite of conversion because you are coming into the shelter of the wings of the divine presence, is how the Gemara speaks about the mikveh obligation there for a convert. Our earliest texts are late Second Temple. Okay, some Tanaitic texts. There's a Tosefta, which is kind of contemporary to the Mishnah, that talks about conversion requiring some sort of declaration of accepting the weight of the halakha, Jewish law. But much later, you've got something called Tractate Geirin, which is like a pseudo Talmudic tractate, but it was redacted after the Talmud, and And it has, I think, that by far the most religious conception of conversion, that it has to be done because of a kind of God intoxication, right? Well, that is, you know, the only acceptable reason to convert, according to Tractate Gerim, is to be makabel ol malchut shamayim, right? Because you want to come under the heavenly kingdom, the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. Whereas earlier texts say nothing like that about religious intention, but do start to introduce obviously religious kind of rituals around conversion, such that it's not just a tribal membership, it has a theological dimension or component. So these are good questions, and more, I suppose, for a historian to kind of disentangle. But certainly by the time you're dealing with any of the rabbinic texts, Tanaitic and onwards, the rabbis do think of conversion as at least in part religious. Of course, Jewish law, the consensus is that even if a convert converts illicitly and for wrong reasons, even perhaps lying to the rabbinical authorities that convert them, Maimonides and Shulchan Aruch and later decisors of Jewish law say that the conversion is still valid. So religious intentionality is not generally thought by halachic thinkers to be neither necessary nor sufficient for converting to Judaism, at least ex post facto. Nonetheless, all of the rabbinic texts think that conversion is at least in part a religious thing, okay? And yet, what you see is they accentuate the part of the book of Ruth that you might have imagined they would have wanted to have kind of brushed under the carpet, right? So they take this famous speech of Ruth, the speech we've looked at already, and they reconceive it as a dialogue rather than a monologue, a dialogue between Ruth and Naomi. And only Ruth's lines were recorded for posterity in the book of Ruth. But thankfully, the rabbis have come along and told us what it was that Naomi was saying, you know, in the middle of what looks like a monologue from Ruth. Okay? And this is how Ruth began. This is how Naomi began. When Naomi saw how determined Ruth was not to abandon her, she started to teach her the laws of conversion. And the first thing she says is, my daughter, Jewish women don't go to the theaters and circuses of the Gentiles. That's law number one. Okay, and that's, you know, and that's very interesting. And it's Jewish girls don't. I don't know, maybe Jewish boys do, but Jewish girls don't do that sort of thing. It's very interesting. If any of you managed to go to the Tsipori National Museum, I think my mother-in-law was there just recently. Or National Park Museum. It has the ruins of the Roman town Tsipori, where Rav Yehuda Hanassi lived, the redactor of the Mishnah. And it was a mixed Jewish-Gentile town that was really quite affluent and was home to many very affluent Jews, some of whom were very assimilated and some of whom, like Rav Yehuda Hanassi, were not. And what you notice is it's a relatively small town with a massive amphitheater, right? And one can only imagine the sorts of things that happened in a Roman amphitheater. I don't know, kind of gladiatorial battles, lions and Christians. I don't know. I'm bringing all my associations of Roman amphitheaters, but they weren't known for kind of showing quaint romantic plays, right? They were places where quite violent and dehumanizing events took place. And the amphitheater was massive. So you could imagine the kind of cultural pressure upon those Jews in Tsipori who didn't want to assimilate, not to go to the theater. So it's kind of interesting how in this source, the very first thing is, Jewish girls don't go to the theater, not to the Gentile theater. And Ruth says, where you go, I will go. Meaning to say, well, what does that mean? Here you go. What does that mean? Where you go, I will go, as a response to don't go to the theater. It means something like, okay, I won't go if you don't go. But it doesn't mean, oh yeah, you're so right, Naomi. It's so inhumane what happens in those theatres. I could never go to such a thing. I adopt that ethic for myself. She says, there's no way you go, I will go. What happens, by the way, if Naomi does go to the theatre? Then so will Ruth. That's the implication. Carrying on, she says, no, Naomi said, oh, my daughter, Jewish women don't live in a house without a mezuzah. Right, at which point, she says, oh, but where you lodge, I'll lodge. Again, she says, she didn't like get some book out by Aryeh Kaplan about the significance of mezuzah and learn, oh, that's such a beautiful law. I really want to make sure that I abide by that in my life. She says, well, don't worry, Naomi. I'm only going to live where you live. And as long as you put a mezuzah on the door, then I'll be living where there's a mezuzah. Don't worry about me. I'm doing what you do. But again, it's not like, oh, I take this upon myself because I believe in it. Moreover, the Midrash says, when Ruth says, your people shall be my people, she refers to her accepting the warnings and punishment that comes along with being Jewish, right? Sometimes it's good for the Jews, sometimes it's bad for the Jews. And if I'm going to follow you, Naomi, that means I take upon myself the slings and arrows of outrageous Jewish fortune, okay? And that's all she means when she says, your people will be my people, because I'm going with you. And finally, when she says, your God shall be my God, that refers to the rest of the commandments. Way to turn orthodoxy into orthopraxy. Good way to turn a religion that's supposed to have belief at its heart and turn it just into practice. She said, your God is my God. And the rabbis take that to mean, oh, I won't wear shatnez and I won't mix milk and meat. Presumably because I'm adopting the norms of your culture. Now, there is another Midrash that appears in the Talmud that goes further. It actually appears in the Talmud's discussion of conversion in Tractate Yevamot. Okay. Let's get there. Yeah. So she said that she says there in the Talmud in Yevamot, interestingly, it's a play on the same basic theme. She says to him things like, do you know, women don't lie in seclusion with men. Jewish women will not be secluded with men. And she says, don't worry, where you dwell, where you sleep, I will sleep. Now, why is this deeply ironic in the book of Ruth?
That's exactly what she does with Boaz. She sleeps.
She goes into seclusion with Boaz.
Yes.
And it's a massive halachic question. And why does she do it?
She's told to.
She's told to by Naomi. So the rabbis imagine Naomi saying to her, oh, you know, we're not secluded with Jewish men. And Ruth couldn't care less. She says, I'll sleep where you sleep. So if you don't have men in the house, then I won't be over that law. If you do, I will. And if you tell me to, as she does in the book, I'll do it. Okay. But the worst part of the discussion in the Talmud is the following. It says, Naomi warns Ruth, idolatrous worship is forbidden to us. Ruth responds, your God is my God. So what did she really mean when she said, your God is my God? She means like, okay, so I'll take my crucifix off. I mean, that's anachronistic okay, I'll ditch my statue of Baal. But it's not like, oh, I'm going to embrace Abrahamic theology because of a deep, I just do what you do, Naomi. Okay. Now, to come back to this kind of more historical conversation that I'm less qualified to discuss about the evolution of Jewish conversion from something tribal to something religious. If the rabbis wanted to make conversion to Judaism less tribal and more religious, they should have gone to these texts and beefed up the theological content. Oh, your God's my God because Sinai, and he made the world in 7 days, and they could have added so many things like that. But instead, the rabbis, who were responsible for the creation of a religious notion of conversion to Judaism, went to these texts and made them less religiously devout than they seemed. It was already remarkable how little theological content they had, and yet they've gone to the text and made them less theologically rich, less theologically devout, right? Kayla adds, it's interesting to think about the dynamic between Naomi and Ruth. It must be how it must have been back in Moab before the menfolk died. That's right. I mean, there's some really interesting questions, Kayla, in the commentaries. Like, did Ruth really only convert now? Right? She married a Jewish guy and they've been living together for ages. This is when the conversion happens. And Boaz seems to relate to his marriage to Ruth as a Levirate marriage. But there's no such thing as a Levirate marriage if the wife isn't Jewish and wasn't Jewish at the point of the wedding. So the Ibn Ezra and others think that Ruth actually converted ages ago. And this is more like a reconfirmation of her conversion rather than the moment of her conversion. But it is interesting to think about their relationship, think about what they'd been through, how marginal they both were to their own societies, as women, as widows, as strangers in a strange land, meaning Naomi being a stranger in a strange land, moving home, and somebody who is at home but who had married out, moving to a strange land to be a stranger. These are certainly worthwhile things to think about, to contextualize these conversations. Absolutely. What I want to do before we get to a Midrash on this week's actual Parsha, well, that's absolutely right. Kayla points out how much Naomi could understand the risk Ruth was about to take, because no one knows better than Ruth after all these years in Moab what it might be like to be an outsider, a female outsider in a foreign patriarchy. What I want to suggest is that the rabbis very deliberately accentuated these elements of the discussion between Ruth and Naomi. And we'll come back to Chovav and Moshe right at the end. But they very deliberately accentuated these aspects of the text, not because they wanted to downplay religious conviction. I want to suggest that they recognized that real religious conviction doesn't emerge in a vacuum. And I want to argue that on the rabbinic conception, religious conviction, in order to be sustainable, requires what you might call cultural mooring. Okay, and I'll speak about what I mean in a minute. But before I do, I want to share with you a notion that I call unthinkability. Okay, there are some things which we find, in an important sense, unthinkable. Now, the reasons why we might find them unthinkable might be multifarious. But what I mean by unthinkability is that you couldn't bring yourself to factor this thought in to your practical reasoning. I'll explain what I mean more in a moment, but let me just say that again. Something is unthinkable to you if you couldn't bring yourself to factor it in to your practical reasoning, to your practical deliberations. So you can literally think about it, but you couldn't bring yourself to act upon it or even to deliberate on its possibility or to deliberate in light of it. This is what some philosophers call volitional necessity, right? So Martin Luther, when he nailed those proclamations to the church door, he said something like, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And you could say to, well, you could do other, right? You didn't have to take that hammer and nail it to the door. So no, I can do no other. The can there is a kind of volitional necessity, given who he is, given his values, given his upbringing, given where he's come to in his life's narrative, it's not possible for him to act otherwise. You know, somebody who has their finger on the trigger and they can't bring themselves to pull the trigger. That's what we're talking about when we talk about volitional necessity. Those things that you can or can't do because of who you are, not because of anything outside of you constraining you. I couldn't bring myself to do it. So sometimes we can't bring ourselves to think about things if what we mean by thinking about them is factoring them into our practical deliberations. For example, let's imagine that, God forbid, one of your loved ones needs a healthy organ, and you happen to know that there's an innocent person living nearby who'd be a perfect match. You don't really consider killing that person to harvest the organs. It would save your loved one, but it's not even on your, it's just not on the list of things that you might think about doing, right? It's just not, it's unthinkable. You can think about it, right? But you can't think about it in the sense that I'm talking about. You can't factor it into your deliberations. There's another, well, both my grandmas are dead, but if someone tried to tell me that my grandma was trying to kill me, you know, while she was alive, well, I know my grandma, okay? But also I had a relationship with her that really mattered to me. And if she found out that I had wrongly accused her of homicide or homicidal intent, that might have ruined our relationship. And therefore, I should be very careful before I come to the conclusion that she's planning to kill me. It might, you know, Kayla might be convinced that my grandma's trying to kill me before I'm convinced. That's to say, it might take less evidence to convince Kayla than it takes me. Why? Because I have a vested interest in this being false. Now, on the other hand, I also have a vested interest in not being killed. So I might start to act very cautiously around my grandma, but I might try to bracket the belief, right? Act as if it's not true in the hope that more evidence will come about, you know, vindicating her. Also, it might just be harder for me to believe the evidence because of all the other things I know about my grandma and also because of the relationship I have with her. And that's, well, we'll get back to whether that's reasonable or rational in a moment, but it certainly seems like it's a fact. That's absolutely right, Kayla. Kayla mentions that very often victims of domestic abuse, they find it harder to accept that there is abuse. Now, that I would say, you know, is this you know, I want to say this without any insinuation, God forbid, of judging a person, but it is in this neutral sense. It is a rational defect, right? There's a sense in which, well, they're not thinking rationally. They're not looking at the evidence rationally. But there are times where I think these sorts of effects are rational. So I take it that I'm in a loving marriage with my wife Gabby, and perhaps this is a better example than my grandma trying to kill me. If Kayla was accidentally, you know, found herself always in the same shopping places as Gabby, And she notices it's quite odd how Gabby keeps buying cyanide from the shop, you know, and various other things lead Kayla over time to believe that maybe Gabby has homicidal intentions, and more evidence comes up, and she starts to think, oh, maybe Gabby wants to kill Sam. I know that these effects can lead victims sometimes not to recognize that they're victims, and I see that that's a problem. But in this case, where I assure you I'm not a victim of my wife's homicidal intent, I think it would be reasonable for me to resist the evidence that it might be reasonable for Kayla to start to be suspicious without it being reasonable for me to be suspicious yet. Sometimes we say to people who we love, well, you owed me the benefit of the doubt. Now, there are interesting questions as to what that means and why that's true, if it's ever true, right? Do you owe me the benefit of the doubt because you're privy to other information that nobody else is privy to, right? So Kayla's seen the cyanide buying, but there's lots of things about Gabby that Kayla hasn't seen that I have seen, and therefore I've got a wider pool of evidence, and that's why I owe Gabby the benefit of the doubt. That might be it. Or it might merely be because there's some sort of relational transaction between Gabby and me, which creates some sort of prima facie duty to disbelieve negative evidence about her, at least until the evidence gets past the threshold, right? So certainly if Kayla can, I need to plug myself in. Certainly if Kayla can bring me overwhelming evidence that Gabby's trying to kill me, I really should take heed, okay? But short of overwhelming evidence, it might be in my best interests to, of course, be a little bit more cautious, but so to speak, to refuse to believe or to demand more evidence, to demand more evidence that Kayla demands. So what we've got in the first case, killing an innocent person to harvest their organs, is that thinkable? No, it's unthinkable. Why? Because of your ethic, because of your kind of membership in the moral community. Being ethical makes some things unthinkable. There's a sense in which the second case is kind of more interesting. It's my relationships with certain people makes it hard for me to believe, hard for me to take serious evidence that suggests my grandma's trying to kill me. I'd need more evidence than other people would need. And it's reasonable that I would demand more evidence than other people would need. I would need more evidence than other people would need to believe that my wife is trying to kill me. And it's reasonable that I would demand more evidence, because right now that's unthinkable to me. And if you want to shake me up enough to make it thinkable, you're going to need loads of evidence, much more evidence than it might take to convince you or a disinterested third party. Here's another example. Converting to Christianity. Okay. Let me explain. If I convert to Christianity, I'm going to lose a lot. Okay. First of all, I don't think Pardes will continue to employ me as one of its adjunct faculty. My mum will go ballistic, right? My family relations will be torn asunder. Okay. My membership in the Jewish community will be attenuated. So there are tremendous what you could call conversion costs that would accrue to me that wouldn't accrue to, let's say, there's some secular white English person who just didn't grow up religious and they convert to Catholicism or they convert to evangelical Christianity. They'd have some conversion costs too, but the conversion costs would be much less salient and perhaps much less severe than my conversion costs. As Tom rightly points out, my wife might then really consider killing me at that point. Okay, so yes, we can all see how the conversion. Well, that means if it's going to cost me more to convert, then I'm within my rights to demand of any would-be proselytizer much more evidence. Are you with me? Right? If, if I've got very little to lose by converting to Christianity, and they say, well, Pascal's wager and everything, might as well take a punt on this religion being true. There's a chance of eternal life. Okay, yeah, but how likely is it true? Well, I'll give you some evidence. There's a very, very smart theologian called Richard Swinburne who thinks there's really, really good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And, I'll read that book and, this very smart guy and he'll give me this evidence. How convinced do I need to be before it might be reasonable or rational? Okay, but I'm going to need more evidence because the costs are higher. Right now, converting to Christianity is unthinkable to me. Okay, it's just not one of the things that could even plausibly be on my to-do list, unless somehow my identity is very, very firmly shaken up. So the idea I'm trying to say is being ethical can make some things unthinkable, having a family can make some things unthinkable, but also being rooted in a specific community can make some things unthinkable. Only if somehow you give me reason to uproot myself from my community could it be reasonable or rational for me to convert to Christianity. Until then, it's unthinkable because I'm rooted in a community. Now, you might think that this is making me irrational because I'm not looking at all evidence equally. In fact, one of the consequences of this view is that I should be more easily moved by evidence for Judaism than I should be moved by evidence for Christianity. Right? Well, that just seems irrational. You should treat all evidence equally. Second, chat. Yes, so Vicky's right. It seems the only way to get rid of this problem is not to have any community. You see, the problem is, right, as soon as you have a single friend, your epistemic faculties, that means your belief forming faculties, they are compromised. Because as soon as you have a friend, you tend overwhelmingly to judge your friend more favorably than your non-friend. Now you could say, well, that's because I know my friend better. I have better evidence. It's not that I'm being irrational. It's not that I'm being biased. It's that I know my friend better. If you knew my friend as well as I know my friend, you'd also judge them favorably. Be that as it may, you still judge your friend more favorably, perhaps more accurately, but more favorably than a random stranger. And therefore, friendship is skewing the way you look at evidence, more favorably, perhaps more accurately for your friends, less favorably, perhaps less accurately for strangers. But having a skew like that seems like a rational defect. And you can't plausibly make friends with every single human being, not in like a meaningful or deep way. So perhaps the only way to escape these kind of rationally corrosive effects is to have no community, no family, and no friends. Just be a hermit. But the problem is that's deeply irrational too. Because we know, given the sort of being that we are, given the sort of animal that we don't flourish without friends, family, and community. So you can start to distinguish between what philosophers call, going back all the way back to Aristotle, call epistemic rationality versus practical rationality. Epistemic rationality is about forming beliefs which are most likely true. Practical rationality is about living in ways which are most likely going to maximize your flourishing. And sometimes those things come apart. For instance, if I was to go to Kayla and say, put a mind reading device upon her head and say, Kayla, believe that 2 + 2 = 5, otherwise I'm going to torture you. My philosophy thought experiments aren't particularly friendly. I'm sorry about this, Kayla. But if I said that to her, Kayla, believe that 2 + 2 = 5, otherwise I'm going to torture you, she would be in this very insidious, either one, situation where she either has to choose to be epistemically rational, which is to be resolute in only forming beliefs which are likely to be true. So therefore, she would never try to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, because there can never be sufficient evidence for that belief, because it's obviously false. But she would be failing to be practically rational in this case, because she's going to be tortured. The practically rational thing to do in this case is, I don't know, try to hypnotize yourself, eat some magic mushrooms, whatever it will do to help you to form the belief that 2 + 2 = 5, even if only temporarily, just so that you can get out of this practical pickle. So sometimes epistemic rationality and practical rationality are in tension with one another. And this is an example of that case. It's practically rational for us to have friends, family, and community. But that is slightly harmful to our epistemic rationality. It means that we're not going to treat all evidence the same. When that evidence interferes with friendships, communal roots, our sense of identity. But I think there are things we can do in order to avoid being culpably closed-minded, okay? And I call this philosophy. I call it entering the philosophy seminar room. All of us, I suggest, in order to be rational, we should spend time in the so-called philosophy seminar room. What I mean by that is it's a kind of mental space. It could literally be taking a philosophy course, or it could just be reading books, or it could be, I don't know. But it's a mental space where you consider all options dispassionately. It's very good for your brain to do that. And it helps us become rounded individuals, but not everything that you consider in that room will you take with you outside that room. Let me give you an example that I think really helps. Solipsism. Solipsism is the view that you are the only person who really exists, or actually put properly, I am the only person who really exists, and all of you guys are just figments of my imagination. That's solipsism. Now, in the philosophy seminar room, we actually take that view seriously. That's a possibility, right? It's a possibility. And actually, moreover, in the philosophy seminar room, it's very hard to come up with a compelling knockdown argument to decisively prove that solipsism is false. Really difficult. And yet, when you leave the philosophy seminar room, you don't give it a second thought, right? When I'm involved in real ethical deliberations, let's say, the thought that I'm actually the only living human being, it doesn't even make the radar. Why not? Because when I was in the philosophy seminar room, I didn't find overwhelming evidence for its truth. But if I did find overwhelming evidence for its truth while I was in there, then I'd have to take that with me when I left. So if we should all be open to the evidence of Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism and Christianity when we're in the philosophy seminar room. Read those books, hear those arguments dispassionately, objectively. But if none of them can give you overwhelming evidence for their truth, it's quite legitimate for you to leave them at the door of the philosophy seminar room when you leave. It's only incumbent upon you to take a doctrine with you into your life outside that room if when you're there you find overwhelming evidence for its truth. Ultimately, The point is, we are rational and we are situated beings. We have roots and we're born with them. And those roots make a difference to what it's rational for us to accept. And I think, based on this, we'll get to our last source in a minute, we only have 3 minutes, but as we think about this, I think the rabbis would say the following. Paul's vision on the road to Damascus was very compelling. But you can have a mystical vision that leads you to Christianity on a Monday, and another mystical vision that leads you to Hinduism on a Wednesday. Mystical experiences come and go. In fact, we were speaking about that a little bit last week, about Mount Sinai and the splitting of the Red Sea, and how the rabbis, at least in the Midrash in Tanchuma, Parshat Bamidbar, they didn't trust those experiences because those experiences are fleeting and they don't give rise to sustained religious commitment, or they don't necessarily give rise to sustained religious commitment. But the rabbis recognize that if you are deeply rooted in the Jewish community, then the only religion that will be so much as thinkable to you will be the Jewish religion. If you're deeply rooted in the Jewish community, Christianity will be unthinkable to you. Hinduism will be unthinkable to you. You'll only be able to bring yourself to convert if you're given in the philosophy seminar room an overwhelming amount of evidence, so much evidence that you voluntarily uproot yourself, that it becomes reasonable and rational to uproot yourself. And let's face it, very few religions do have overwhelming evidence that they're true. They all trade in some evidence, some arguments. But if you're rooted in the Jewish community, you'll only need some evidence for it to become plausible to you that Judaism is true, because it will be the only thinkable option. And that's why the rabbis, even when they start to view conversion as religious as well as tribal, the thing they most want to know is, are you deeply committed to the Jewish people like Ruth was to Naomi? Because if that's your basis, if that's where you start, then you are much more likely to have a sustainable relationship with Judaism, with the religion of Judaism, moving forward. And this is the last Midrash I want to share with you, and the last Midrash of our course. It's in the light of seeing what the rabbis do to Ruth, and it's in the light of seeing how the rabbis understand conversion, that I think you can make deep sense of this Midrash here, from the Tsipori to Bamidbar. And it's a Midrash that imagines that Chovav doesn't convert. Like I said, a lot of Midrashic voices imagine that Chovav does convert, but this Midrash imagines that he doesn't. And it doesn't seem to judge him at all. It says the following: there are some who have a land, but no possessions. Others who have possessions, but no family. But I have a land, possessions, and family, and I was a judge in my land. If I will not go home because of my land, I will go because of my possessions. And if I will not go because of my possessions, I will go because of my family. Chovav, nobody denies that he believes in the God of Judaism, like Naaman later on in the Bible. He believes in the God of Judaism. But he is rooted elsewhere. And because he's rooted elsewhere, according to this Midrash, he's not, conversion isn't a thinkable option to him, and he's not really to be blamed for that. It's just a function of the way he is rooted. Ruth, by contrast, doesn't have sustainable roots anymore. She was a widow in a land, and a time where it was very, very difficult to be a widow. And she had anyway married somebody who was a foreigner, which had probably alienated her already to some extent from the people amongst whom she lived. If anything, she was rooted more to Naomi than she was than she was to anybody in Moab. Nice point, Kayla, about Yitro. Yitro does have some roots in the Jewish people. You're right. His daughter is married to Moshe. He's got grandchildren there. But we imagine he has many more children. You know, it's one child, and he's got other children back in Midian. And he also has responsibilities in Midian. Even possessions. Ruth, we're led to believe by this stage in her life, was poor because she has to go and glean in the land of Israel. All of those things, the rabbis seem to think legitimately. Right? The rabbis are saying, look, and this explains also in part why Judaism doesn't proselytize. It can be quite reasonable and rational for non-Jews not to want to convert because they're rooted. And that's fine, as long as their roots aren't leading them to do immoral things, which we should complain about. It's fine. Second. Ruth's connection to Naomi, by contrast, eclipsed everything else in her life. She was therefore able to convert. Chovav, according to this Midrash, was too firmly rooted in foreign soil. And this doesn't seem to be a criticism of Chovav. He could certainly be a righteous monotheist with roots in another community. But so long as he was rooted elsewhere, he couldn't become a Jew. So I think this is kind of interesting. It relates, if people are interested, to communitarianism in contemporary philosophy, which is the idea that there's something of a myth. It's something of a myth to think that you can really make sense of who and what you are outside of your cultural, familial, communal context. We are inherently kind of socially situated as people, and that affects what is reasonable and rational for us to do, given the situations in which we find ourselves. And I see that in these midrashim. I see that in the rabbinic approach to the conversion. And what we've noticed is that the rabbis make this point in part by accentuating something quite surprising about the biblical texts. And the surprising thing about the biblical texts which are accentuated is the extent to which anything close to conversion in the Jewish Bible is presented as being primarily tribalistic and only secondarily, if at all, theological. You see that with Chovav, Moshe pleading with him not to leave, and you see that with Ruth pleading with Naomi not to be allowed to leave. Okay, I hope you've had an interesting taste in a number of different styles of Midrashim, a number of different Midrashic agendas. And I hope you've learned something about our weekly Parshiot as well. Please feel free to stay in touch. My website, samlebens.com. It's where you can find me. All right, thank you very much.